Hey guys, Farmer Jesse here. Before we get into the weeds, I feel like this one's out of tune. Last week, big shout out to Meg and Joe for catching it. I did a little bit of a giveaway. It was kind of ridiculous, and they'll probably maybe always be a little bit ridiculous, but I'm gonna do one every week. So basically, we'll give something away every week in every one of these videos, hidden in the video or in the show notes or somewhere. Sometimes it may be something kind of ridiculous. Sometimes maybe it'll be a t-shirt or a tote bag, or if we can get enough subscribers, maybe something from somebody else that's kind of cool. So this is incentive for you guys to subscribe because they will always be time sensitive. Hit the little subscribe button, also hit that little bell so that way you get the notifications. You watch these videos, you learn a little bit about farming, and maybe win something fun. All right, so hopefully that prize thing will lessen the blow when I tell you, confession, I made a little bit of a clickbaity title. There isn't necessarily one thing that will give you a weed-free garden. There is, but it's not a thing. It's not a physical thing you can hold like a stirrup-hoe, although this is a really great tool. And there's no herbicide, obviously we're organic, and then there's no like weed picking robot, although it'd probably work. It's something a little bit more abstract. It's a strategy. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about our weed strategy, also how the no-till thing plays into it. So let's do it. You know, I should start by saying we're not a weed-free garden. We're kind of a weed-controlled garden. You know, especially last year when it was just Hannah and myself, when we first started on our property, the weeds got a little bit out of hand, and we paid for that in the beginning of the season. We were fighting off a lot of pigweed. We were fighting off a little bit of plantain, which I didn't even know was a weed that you could really have in your garden. But I want to talk about some strategies that we use to fight off weeds and kind of a basic overview of the strategies that you need. So I came over here for a reason. One of the first elements, there are three parts to the weeding strategy, which is like preemptive weeding, sort of simultaneous weeding, and then sort of emergency weeding. Basically, you have to have a plan in place for each of those. So our preemptive weeding, our sort of pre-emergent weeding, it starts, basically this was potatoes. It was a little bit weedy potatoes, but it was potatoes. So all the potatoes are out. We've sowed a cover crop. It's not quite coming up just yet. It's probably just now germinating. But what we did was after the potatoes came out, we had this tarp. It's on the white side right here, but it's actually a black tarp. And I did a video about tarping. We had the tarp laid out, so we killed back all of the grasses and any weed seed that was dug up during the potato plowing process. And then we put down a cover crop. So what will happen is that the cover crop will come up. It'll block out any weed seed that are still sort of left in there because it's going to be buckwheat and Sudan grass. Both are really fast growing. And then I'm gonna mow that, and then I'm gonna form my beds in the no-till system. So no-till, I'm gonna talk about this towards the end of the video, but no-till is also part of the overall weed strategy. In fact, it's more of we're hoping it to be maybe more of a weed solution than a weed strategy. So anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's one of the preemptive things you can do. Another sort of preemptive thing you can do in terms of you know, getting weeds out is stale seed bedding. So if we wanted to in that potato plot, we could have just let it sit there for a while, let the weeds kind of germinate, and then we could have harrowed it or put the tarp over or however we wanted to deal with those weeds. And then that's called stale seed bedding. And you can also do stale seed bedding and flame weeding. As you can see, like, you know, we put a little bit of compost down. We had some weeds come up through it. We went ahead and sowed our green onions in there. And then after a few days, I think it was about 3 days, maybe 4 days, I went through and flame weeded it. And then that allowed for those green onions, as you can see, to kind of come into a weed-free bed. And I just realized that sheep are out. Okay, sheep weren't out. I was wrong. So you're staying on top of them, and you're just getting them before any crops go in the ground. So another thing that you can do also on top of that is just, you know, if you're doing direct seeding, you have to do some of those things. If you're doing transplants, you should do all those things too. But you know, growing great transplants is a great way to get ahead of the weeds, because if you put a full ready to go plant in the ground, it's going to outrun a lot of weeds, which is really important, especially if your soil preparation is good. That will get you ahead of the weeds a little faster than you know, other tactics. As you can see, we just mowed down our corn. There's the sheepies. we just mowed down our corn, and we basically just put the tarp right over top to kind of help that corn break down a little bit, but also to germinate any weeds that were produced in that sort of weedy corn patch, right? It was, we allowed that to get a little weedy because we're not planning on planting anything in there next year, although now I'm kind of thinking I want to use it as a seed plot, so maybe that was stupid. But we're gonna go ahead and get all the weeds out that we can, then sow it to a cover crop for the winter. So strategy 2 is, you know, simultaneous weeding, weeding while plants are in the ground or coming up. And really the key to simultaneous weeding, especially, you know, there are several different ways to do it. There are several different tools. You know, we use our collinear hoe and we use our stirrup hoe and those sorts of things. There's also landscape fabric, which is a really great way to basically tarp and grow at the same time. I think if you had a really bad weed year, like we did last year, we had a really bad weed year. Some of the weeds got away from us. So you end up with a lot of weed seed. I think using landscape fabric in that situation is a great way to get you back to having a lower weed seed bank. It reduces the amount of space where weeds are going to germinate, and I kind of like it because it is sort of a no-till option. I mean, it's not maybe my favorite because it's plastic, but it is kind of a great option for reducing your weeds and, you know, keeping in your moisture and also creating a little habitat for worms and stuff to crawl underneath it. So it is an option, and it warms up your soil early in the spring. I want to emphasize that technique and timing are really important when it comes to using a hoe. If you do it when it's too wet, all you're doing is slicking your soil and you're creating clumps, kind of compacting the soil, and you're making it harder for the roots to get through. Also, the technique is important. You know, going in between the plants really carefully, and then above the plants and below the plants. And you have to do that all the way through. Now, I demonstrated that on our no-till beds, which require maybe slightly different management, but we'll talk about that in a second. And another important note about hoeing is it's like I said, it's about timing. And what I mean by that is we hoe, especially, you know, in a cultivated and tilled system, in a tillage system, you want to cultivate after every single rain. It's vitally important to cultivate as much as possible. Because, especially while the plants are growing, once they establish their canopy, you're okay, but you want to cultivate after every major rain, or at least get it on a routine if you have good irrigation, that you're doing it every week. And texture is vitally important. So if it doesn't slick too badly, you know, just kind of crumbles like this, it's hard to see it in the camera, but if it sort of turns to mud as you're sort of pushing it between your fingers, that's just too wet. All it's gonna do is slick out, and it's gonna be hard for the roots to get around it. It's not gonna help you, and it may not even kill the weeds. You're trying to, you know, get those budding weeds. So what that means is that you're not just cultivating when you see weeds, you're cultivating the soil. You're constantly keeping it, you know, fresh from weed seed. You're always going lightly. You're never going very deep. You're just going right in that first inch of soil to try and kill any weed seeds that are germinating, even if you don't see them. That part is key, especially in a tillage system, to stay on top of the weeds. And your paths are kind of the same way. Don't allow for your paths to get really weedy before you go through with a stirrup hoe or a wheel hoe, or even a tiller if you're going to use that, and get them cleaned up. I think it's important to just stay on top of it, because as soon as you let them get out of hand, then you have a lot of emergency weeding, which is kind of strategy number 3. Now, I'm mostly proud of how good our garden looks right now. I think that we have some weeds, of course, but nothing that's really emergency except for one section, and this is an important note, at the very furthest part of our garden from our house, those 2 plots are the most weedy that we have. And what that means is that, like, you know, if we want to recover them, if there's anything in there we really need and we want to stop, we don't want to have a bunch of weed seed growing in there, basically we have to just suck it up. I mean, emergency weeding comes down to this. How badly do you need the crop, and how much do you not want to deal with those weeds next year? I think weeds can be really overwhelming. I always use this analogy where when you look out at weeds, it becomes really overwhelming. But when you look straight down, there's not that many in front of you. So what I always recommend is just get a beer, turn on a podcast, maybe like Ologies, they have a beer episode, and then, you know, just go to work, just go at it. It will shock you how fast you can clean up a bed of weeds, especially if you're just like, I'm gonna do it. And you do it. And then you go, you know, if it's carrots, and you just get a drink, get a friend, and then just bust it out. because ultimately, one, it'll make you feel better, but two, it just, protect that crop and then keep your weed seed bank from growing. And it'll just be, overall, you'll feel better about it. Also, those aren't weeds, those are carrots. This is a really crappy stand of carrots, but we'll talk about all that in another video, but that's carrots. And then this is crap. This is crap germination. But that's carrots and they look great. One quick note about tools. I love tools, but I would rather have a good strategy and a collinear hoe than I would have all the tools in the world. Because if you have a bad strategy, if you're not, dedicating yourself to getting out there after the rains and always cultivating the soil, and not the plant, you're always cultivating the soil, not the plant. If you're just going around your plants, you're still gonna get weeds. You really need to be cultivating the entire bed top. So if you're not doing that, it doesn't matter what tools you have. Like the flame weeder is just a tool in the toolbox. The tarps are just a tool in the toolbox. You need all of these tools, but what you really need is a good strategy. Check out our vlog this week for more info about the no-till fall garden. I'm doing a little vlog about that. But basically, I'm trying to figure out how to manage weeds in the no-till system, because it's not that there aren't weeds. There are weeds. They're just kind of spotty. So far, I've just been sort of walking through and hand picking them, which has been pretty effective. I mean, there's almost nothing in this, even though it's had a couple rains and it's been uncovered for a few weeks. We laid down our no-till beds with compost, and then we mulched those paths, and then also put a tarp over top of all of it for about 3 or 4 weeks. So it's pretty weed-free anyway, but it doesn't mean when I put those plants in that I didn't dig up some more weed seed or something, but I haven't seen much of anything. So that fall garden is doing really well. This is doing really well here. This is all just various, herbs and green onion, celery, and some other things here. Some lettuces going out, some chard coming in over top of some lettuces. There are weeds in here, in the pads a little bit. One thing I've noticed quite a lot, maybe I can find an example of this, where we tend to see the most weeds, it's not in the middle of the paths where we've laid down mulch or wood chips. It tends to be here. I'll show you here, like right here on the sides where this is the bed, right? There's a little bit of weeds right around this chard, and some groovy weed, but so right here on the sides where the beds meet the paths, that seems to be our biggest problem area when it comes to weeds, is right there where the beds meet the paths. So really I just need to be putting down, if our compost would come a little bit further down on top of the paths, and our paths would kind of come over a little bit cleaner and closer right up against the beds, then I think that problem will go away. But it is kind of a pain to manage, because hand weeding stuff out of the bed is one thing, that comes out pretty easy, but hand weeding it out of the paths is kind of hard because the roots are so established. But I'm feeling pretty good about it. I mean, really, there hasn't been, the amount of handwork that I've done is very little, and it's been noticeably less weeding in general over all these beds. So what percentage of that was just from our good weeding in the beginning of the year, I don't know, but so far so good. So if you've made it this far, you're awesome. You've also made it to the point when I talk about the giveaway. So this week's giveaway is, this past Christmas I got a microphone and I was testing it out this week, and I recorded a version of Baudelaire's Correspondence in French, in a ridiculous dramatic French accent, as a test run. So I will send you a audio copy of that. Here's how you enter. I will pick the best anagram of Charles Baudelaire, put in the YouTube comments. That person gets a copy of this audio file, and it's... So that's this week's ridiculous giveaway. I hope you enter. I hope you subscribe. If you like this video, please like this video. Yeah, the bobble will pop up. Hit that thing. That has our faces on it. That'll take you right to the subscription thing. And we'll see you guys later. Bye, guys.